First of all, just to respond to what you said about this understanding, this approach having been around for a few thousand years. Yes, it's true that the non-dual understanding has been around for a few thousand years, but remember, the non-dual understanding is not a body of information. It's not a teaching or something that can be written down in a book and preserved over the centuries. It is simply the understanding of our essential nature. So it's been around forever. It's because it's always been the essence of what each of us are. So although this understanding can be formulated, and the formulation is conditioned by the time and the place in which it arises. So the formulation changes all the time, but the understanding that is being referred to is the same understanding in all people at all times and in all places. In other words, it's the understanding of our essential nature. So
you say, for instance, in one of your YouTube videos that you were kind of upset that nobody told you about this before, right? I'm 55 years old now. When I recently heard about this, I had a bit of similar feeling.
Yes, well, I think what I referred to was when I met Francis, I was in my mid to late 30s, and I had already been studying the Advaita tradition for 20 years before that, but in the classical Advaita Vedanta tradition, not the direct path, which is what we're exploring here. And so a few years after I met Francis, now in my late 30s, everything that I had explored and at least to a certain extent had some intellectual understanding of became my lived and felt experience. In other words, he provided these experiential pathways that made real for me what until then had been not just theory, but somewhere between my experience and theory. It was I had the deep intuition that what I was learning in the classical tradition was true, but I had not yet made it my own. So when I met Francis, particularly in the first few years, that there were almost every time I went to satsang with him, there were these recognitions, these insights, and I realized, that's what they were talking about. That's what they were saying for 20 years, but because it was wrapped in a language that came from a different time and a different place, from the time and place in which I found myself. It was foreign to me. Enlightenment always seemed something exotic. Enlightenment always came with a white beard and an orange robe. It seemed at an infinite distance from myself, a 30-something-year-old Westerner. So it was Francis that made the understanding real, connected it with my experience. And so it was out of that feeling that I said, why didn't somebody tell me this before? Of course, they were saying it all along. When I went back to reading Ramana Maharshi, I realized, he had said it all. But because he's rather spare in the way he speaks, and he hadn't really joined the dots, he hadn't been able to give me the pathways that Francis was able to give me. So that's why what I really meant was, when I said, why didn't somebody tell me this before? What I really meant was, why didn't I meet you 20 years ago? But even if he'd been around 20 years ago, I'm not sure that I would have been ready. Jean Klein, his teacher, was in fact teaching in London 20 years ago, just down the road from the School of Classical Advaita, where I was regularly attending in my late teens and 20s. But I never went to hear him. I never even knew he existed. And if he had, I'm sure that I wouldn't have understood what he was talking about. So I needed to go through those 20 years. Not everybody does, but I needed to go through those 20 years in the classical school in order to prepare the ground for my subsequent meeting with Francis.
Last night you mentioned, I think, something about the sacred mission to, if I understood it well, to spread this so that suffering can end, or all the unnecessary suffering can be limited. This is kind of connected to the relatively unknownness of this approach, as you also mentioned. How could we make this common knowledge?
Yes.
Make it a compulsory subject at a school like this, maybe?
Yeah. Yeah. Just to comment on what you said about this sacred mission, I tend not to be very missionary. So I hope I didn't refer to a sacred mission. It's true that I did say something about sharing this understanding, each of us in our own way. So I'm doing that in one way, and many people do it in all sorts of ways. And of course, technology makes it very easy. How many people here did not come to this meeting or to your first meeting with me as a result of YouTube? So that's about 20 out of 200. That means 90%, between 80 and 90% of the people here came by YouTube. That's amazing. 50 years ago, 100 years ago, you had to walk from mountain to mountain. You had to drive to India and then walk from ashram to ashram, hoping that sooner or later you'd meet someone that in your own language, although the guy was Indian, probably didn't speak English, hoping that he would somehow be able to speak to you in your own language, in a way that is relevant to your own life. What were the chances? Think of all the people who in whenever it was, the 40s and 50s, who were fortunate enough to meet Ramana Maharshi, Atmananda Krishna Menon, or Nisargadatta. Most of them misunderstood what they were saying. Even those people that were fortunate enough to meet these people, because these people were they didn't join the dots like I do. They tended to. They gave much more sparing suggestions or pathways, and they didn't. The teaching wasn't as full. There wasn't so much explanation because they weren't used to Westerners asking questions. That even many of the people that went to these three sages and others, even then many of them didn't understand what was being said. So I just say that because technology is one of them. It's an amazing tool in our era for communicating. But why, just going to your original question, why, it's not so much why if this teaching has been available for 2,500 years, have not more people been exposed to it and realized it, but more importantly, more interestingly, that's an interesting question, but more interesting, why if our essential being is always available, irrespective of whether you come across the non-dual teaching or not? Why, if the essential being of everybody is available to everybody at every moment, why do so few people recognize the nature of their essential being, where their essential being is shining in their experience at every moment? No need to travel to India or to visit a teacher to find it. It's right there, shining in each of our minds all the time. The knowledge I, or the I am? Is there anybody here for whom the knowledge I or I am is not permanently shining in your minds? Or not just those of us here, in everybody, in everybody's experience, the knowledge of themselves, the knowledge I or the knowledge I am, is shining in the midst of their experience. It's always I that who is depressed, I who am happy, I who am miserable, I who am married, I who am sad, I who am 35 years old. It's always I, right there shining in the midst of every experience, from depression to ecstasy to everything. Why is this I, which is shining brightly in all experience, in everybody's experience, 24/7? Why have so few? Why does it so rarely recognize its essential self? A very easy answer. I don't know.
In relation to that, having experienced the peace it can kind of bring you to apply this knowledge.
Can you say that again?
Having experienced the kind of peace
yes.
this can give, thinking about peace conferences that the world seems to need nowadays, is there anything being done with this knowledge, this insight, to bring more peace to the world, maybe, to the big conflicts, terrorism, all these... instead of a war on terrorism?
There was a beautiful attempt. Did any of you see the... I don't know that it played in Europe. It was in New York. It was a play called Oslo. Oslo. Did anyone see or read or hear about this play? And it was about a play. It was to do with the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis when Yasser Arafat was head of the PLO, and it was an attempt made by a Norwegian man. Can somebody remind me his name? Not to worry. There was this a Norwegian man, that's why it was called Oslo, who at the time arranged secret meetings between the Israelis and the Palestinians that were nothing to do with the formal negotiations that were going on. Not even the Americans knew about these meetings. It's a true story. And he had a single thesis, this Norwegian guy, and the thesis was this, that if you put the Israeli Secret Service and the PLO in a room, if you lock them up in a house somewhere in the south of Norway for long enough, and you made them delicious meals, and you just got them together without any agenda, you just got them together for long enough, sooner or later they would make friends. And the play was brilliant. It showed these two warring factions coming together, both of whom thought each other terrorists. And they met in secret in this house in the south of Norway. And to begin with, it was full of hostilities and conflicts, and then every scene was a new meeting, and then they'd go their separate ways. They'd come back, they'd meet again in this house 2 weeks later. And so this process lasted a few months, and it was brilliantly done. It showed how in time, through all the conflicts, they slowly began to see the person behind the terrorist. They stopped relating to each other as terrorists. They began to relate to each other as people. And you could see that what they were actually doing was exactly the same as the process that I went through with Annick, exploring who everyone essentially is. They would never formulate it like that, but actually what they were doing, they were seeing through all the layers that had previously separated them and generated so much conflict, and they began to see first of all the human being in the other, and then in time they began just to feel the being behind the human being, and friendship started arising, the sense of sharing something in common rather than always being at odds with each other. Well, it failed in the end. But it was a brave attempt. And if any, I don't know if it'll ever be released in any other form or come to Europe, but it was a very moving play. So now, back to your question. Is anything happening in peace conferences to do this? As far as I know, no. I've never heard about it. When you hear of these conferences, all they are doing is negotiating the objects of experience. All they ever talk about are the ideas, the boundaries, the conflicts, the policies, the negotiations. They never go to the source of peace. They think that peace can be arrived at by negotiating boundaries and policies. Peace will never be arrived at in that way. If we want to find peace in ourselves, let's forget nations. Let's not forget conflicting nations for the moment. Let's just talk about ourselves. If we want to find peace in ourselves, there's only one place to find it. It is in that which is inherently peaceful, our being. And every time we experience peace, we are actually experiencing our own being. Likewise, in conflict in intimate relationships, two partners have two different views about something. They're arguing about it. It forms conflict in their relationship. The conflict is very rarely resolved by agreeing on the issue. Normally, both parties have to step out of the issue and make contact with their shared being, which is prior to their issue, and establish the love, the connection again. They may then come back to discuss the issue, but they come back from the place of peace. They don't discuss the issue in order to find peace. So the peace is always prior to the conflict and is never found as a result of resolving the conflict. You first find the peace and then the conflict is resolved. You don't resolve the conflict and then find the peace. And this is, to my knowledge, completely missing now let's go back to nations rather than individuals. In the dialogues we hear, and look at Trump and Kim Jong-un, the Americans and the Koreans. Imagine if we had these two characters here, and we undertook the simple experiment that I went through with Anik earlier. First of all, in yourself, who are you really? Not your ideas about your territories or about nuclear war, or not your ideas, not your feelings, not your history, not your memories, but what are you essentially? And imagine if both people were to go all the way back, not halfway back, all the way back to what they essentially were. And to touch, to realize, to recognize their essential uncolored being, which is not Korean or American or male or white or however many years old, but just, and then imagine if they did the experiment that we did, and they did that, they swapped places, they took the position of the other, they put themselves in the shoes of the other with all their conditioning, and then they conducted the same experiment so that they felt, not just understood, but felt that the other was truly themselves. How long would it take? 5 minutes?
But why don't we?
20 minutes probably in their case. But as long as they were willing, that they could conduct the experiment, and that their own being, it's not that they have as much access to their own being as Ramana Maharshi had to his. And that's all it would take if they were then, having touched that both in themselves and realized it about one another, they would then to try to work together in such a way that expressed this new understanding. how long would it take to come to a resolution? They would do it in an afternoon. But unless they are willing or able to do that, they will never find peace, because there's nowhere else to find peace. At best, they will arrive at a fragile standoff. That's the best we can hope for in the world, is a fragile standoff between these two powers. And that standoff will appear to be peace, but it's not peace. It's conflict contained. And I don't see, I don't hear or read about anything in politics, or I don't know of anyone in politics who is even there may be, but I don't know of them, who is bringing this possibility to the table.
I think you could be the...
You know, I think I'm not very diplomatic.
But that's maybe a Nobel Peace Prize.
I'm a little too radical and direct. But this is what it would take. I feel this is the world's only chance for peace, would be to come to this understanding.
But you have the United Nations who kind of work towards peace, but not very successful.
Not very successful, because none of the individuals who make up the United Nations know where to find peace in themselves. Is it surprising, therefore, that they cannot bring peace to their countries? They're not in touch with the source of peace in themselves. The best they can hope for is a Cold War, a fragile alliance, a contained conflict. That's the best we can hope for at the moment.
Yeah, but can't we bring this knowledge to the United Nations first?
By all means, if you know someone in the United Nations, send them this clip. Linda will put it on YouTube. And
do you have some recommendable YouTube videos that could be?
You have to ask Linda, because she decides what goes on YouTube, and I never watch them. So I don't really know I know what's there, but I don't know the details. But there are others. For instance, someone just mentioned Eckhart Tolle, who has a much bigger audience than I have. And I think one of the reasons he has there may be other reasons, I don't know, but one of the reasons is that he's less radical than I am. He has a way of tailoring this understanding to a larger community, a larger spectrum of the community, and perhaps, when I say, I don't mean watering it down, because I don't mean that in a negative way, but not quite so radically and not quite so directly. And I say that because I have great respect for Eckhart Tolle and what he's doing. And because it is less radical and direct, it represents less of a confrontation for most people, and therefore more people would be are happy to listen to him. Many of those that are happy to listen to him would be a little challenged by what we say here. This is a step too far for some people. Although, having said that, what is being suggested here? Am I really suggesting anything so radical? It's radical in the sense that we go directly to the root of the problem, to the source of peace. But it's not. I'm not asking anyone to believe anything. On the contrary, I specifically encourage people not to believe anything, including not to believe anything I say. So, and I noticed there are more people here this year than there were last year. So, who knows where this teaching will go, into whose lap it will fall. But I share your interest. I've often wondered, here, this is a rather rarefied group of people, and we're discussing rather rarefied ideas about awakening and the recognition of our true nature. And most people, if you ask them, if we did a survey on the street of all 7 billion people and asked them, are you interested in enlightenment, awakening, the recognition of your true nature? Most people wouldn't know what you were talking about and would consider that a kind of a sort of intellectual pursuit that had nothing to do with everyday life. But if we asked those same 7 billion people, are you interested in happiness? Or are you interested in peace? Is there a single one that would not say yes? Actually, enlightenment is just the exotic name for peace and happiness. The search for enlightenment is just the home straight in our search for happiness. It's just the final furlong in our search for happiness. It's the same search. But the search for enlightenment, we could say that the search for enlightenment begins when our search for happiness turns away from objective experience. When we realize, or at least intuit, that the objects of experience, objects, substances, activities, relationships, cannot provide happiness. And that's the moment we turn around, this turning around, this investigation into who we essentially are. That's when the common search for happiness turns into the search for enlightenment. And what is tragic, in a way, you could say it's both, it's the subject of both comedies and tragedies. But what is tragic is that for which all people long, and the vast majority of us, which is happiness, the vast majority of us seek it through acquiring an object, or a substance, or a relationship, or an exotic experience, or some kind of activity. And of course, none of us ever find it there. So, as Henri David Thoreau said, most men lead lives of quiet desperation. Because most people are seeking happiness in the place where it, by definition, can never be found. But what is so tragic is that what all these people are seeking is not something that is alien to them. It's not at a distance from them. It is closer to them than their own breath. It's not that it's hard to find. It's just that they're looking in the wrong direction. There is nothing exotic about enlightenment. There's nothing extraordinary about it. Enlightenment is simply the recognition of our own essential being as it is, before it has been colored by experience. That's it. And it is equally available. Ramana Maharshi had no more access to his own being than Donald Trump has to his, or you and I have to ours. We all have equal access.
But what you just say for happiness equally goes for peace, right?
It's the same thing, peace and happiness. I use the words synonymously, as a Dutch teacher, Walter Keers, once said beautifully, peace is happiness at rest, and happiness is peace in motion. It's the same thing.